From the Albuquerque Journal, this is the leading news. I'm Gino Gutierrez. It's Tuesday, November 18th. Here's what we're covering on today's episode. Despite falling short of reaching Albuquerque's mayoral runoff election this year, Alex Uballez could still have an impact on the race's outcome. With more on this, I'm now joined by the Journal's Capitol Bureau Chief Dan Boyd, who's been following this story. Dan, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Dan, obviously we know that the runoff election taking place on December 9th here in Albuquerque will be between incumbent Mayor Tim Keller and challenger Darren White, but as we touched on at the start, Alex Uballez, who did not make the runoff, still got a pretty significant portion of the vote, and an endorsement in the race for Keller could swing the election in the incumbent's favor.
Yeah, this has been kind of an interesting dynamic to watch since Election Day. As you mentioned, Tim Keller and Darren White were the two candidates who were the top two finishers. Alex Uballez finished in third place with almost 20% of the votes cast, and I think performed better than a lot of people thought he would. Keller had 36%, Darren White had 31%. So interestingly, I think a lot of people were watching to see if Alex Uballez would endorse Tim Keller. They're both kind of from the more, progressive Democratic kind of approach, even though these are technically, not partisan elections. But I did talk to Alex Uballez today. He's met at least twice with Tim Keller since Election Day, but interestingly, still not deciding to endorse Keller for the race, even though he has said, urged his supporters not to vote for Darren White.
And Dan, kind of the real fascinating part of this story is Uballez on election night urged his supporters that they really can't allow Darren White to become mayor, but as you mentioned, still undecided about an endorsement for Keller. And as you also mentioned, he's met with Keller a few times, but the two really are kind of hung up on a few key issues. What are those?
Yeah, he did talk about that. He said in the meeting that the two of them had last week, that he kind of laid out some of his conditions that he would like to see Mayor Keller kind of embrace certain issues in order for him to kind of give his formal endorsement or kind of public backing of Keller. So far, it sounds like Keller hasn't felt like he's needed to do that, which is kind of an interesting dynamic. And some of these issues, just for an example, are things that Uballez kind of ran on during the election, including kind of rent assistance, some kind of tribal consultation issues regarding the petroglyphs, kind of thing. Those are among the issues. So I think from Uballez's perspective, it's kind of in the ball's in Keller's court now to see if if he's willing to take on those issues as part of his platform. And until then, it doesn't sound like Uballez is planning to endorse unless that happens.
And Dan, one of the interesting things you mentioned in your story is that the Keller campaign has said they would welcome an endorsement by Uballez, but doesn't necessarily view it as something that would swing the race.
Yeah, that was kind of the interesting, and that's kind of the question in a lot of people's minds. I mean, these endorsements can be interesting and politically they can certainly have some intrigue, but whether or not that would ultimately sway the 20%, the roughly 25,000 voters in Albuquerque who voted for Uballez. The question has been, we haven't thought they would probably vote for Darren White in the runoff, but if they decide to sit out the runoff, or if they go out and vote for Keller, that's kind of the question. And it does seem, that an endorsement from Uballez might convince some of them to vote for Keller, but even Uballez today acknowledged that some of them may vote for the mayor anyway, even without him, kind of having to make that endorsement.
And Dan, as we mentioned earlier, the runoff election on December 9th, but your story also mentions a few other key dates for voters to keep in mind as well. What are those?
Yeah, so this is a very consolidated election, kind of a sprint to the runoff, which is on December 9th, so just a few weeks away. Absentee ballots will be sent out starting this week, starting on Tuesday, and then on December 1st, early voting begins. So, a lot happening in a short amount of time. There's already been at least one debate, and I believe there will be another televised debate between the candidates next week. So a lot going on. I think Keller and White are both kind of focused on this mano a mano in the runoff election, but kind of an interesting lingering dynamic about whether, Uballez will come forward with an endorsement or not.
And Dan, last question before I let you go. Obviously, Uballez has not made an endorsement in the mayor's race, but he actually has in the two city council races that are also in runoff elections.
Yeah, that's right. There's, in addition to the mayoral runoff, there's also two city council races also going to be decided on that same date in the runoff election. So Uballez did say that, he's rallying support for those two candidates and would do so for Keller as well if, some of these conditions that we talked about are met. Uballez did say today he didn't expect to still be this busy, after not making it to the runoff election. But I think a lot of folks are kind of interested in what he might do next and kind of certainly his impact on this runoff election.
So with the runoff election several weeks away, it'll be interesting to see if Uballez does indeed give Keller an endorsement. Journal Capitol Bureau Chief Dan Boyd stopping by to share the latest with us. Thank you so much, Dan.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate it.
As concerns over homelessness in Albuquerque continue to grow, so do the number of people living on the streets. With more on this, I'm now joined by Journal reporter Nikayla McClellan, who's been following this story. Nikayla, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Gino.
So Nikayla, the story you wrote on Monday had to deal with the yearly point in time or PIT count. Before we jump into what the figures of that were, can you tell our listeners a little bit of what this count is?
Absolutely. So every year, a bunch of volunteers with the New Mexico Coalition to End Homelessness go across the city and they count the number of people on the streets or at a shelter for one specific night to get a broad idea of how many homeless people are living in Albuquerque.
And Nikayla, the interesting part about this count this year is there was actually an increase of those experiencing homelessness. What can you tell us about those figures?
Yeah, so this year's PIT number showed about an 8% increase or 220 people compared to last year in 2024. So that means that 2,960 people in Albuquerque called the streets or an emergency shelter their home. And of that number, 1,367 people were completely unsheltered, meaning they had no roof over their head.
And Nikayla, another thing that's really interesting about your story is the fact that you had a chance to talk to some service providers, and they really talked about how these growing figures reflect other issues like housing instability and limited affordable units.
Yeah, so they said that there was a sharp uptick that may be linked to inflation, repeals of pandemic-era relief programs, which momentarily paused evictions, and a couple other things in that nature that may have increased or caused the increase of that homeless number.
And I want to kind of dive into these figures a little bit more, Nikayla, that we saw from this survey. There were a few groups that were disproportionately represented. What can you tell us about them?
Yeah, so traditionally in these reports, children tend to be underrepresented because people will do whatever it takes to keep a child out of the streets, even if it's just for a night. And on the inverse of that, certain groups were overrepresented in the data. So Indigenous people make up about 9% of New Mexico's population, but 17% of them were unsheltered in this study.
And another really interesting fact that was bared out in this survey, Nikayla, was that half of those that were involved were not even from New Mexico.
Yeah, so a large portion of those people actually came from places like Texas, Arizona, or Colorado, which makes sense because they are our neighboring states. But 36% of those respondents said that they were not homeless before moving to New Mexico. So something to keep an eye out for the future.
And Nikayla, last question for you, and this is a really interesting part of your story. It's that the PIT numbers are really kind of a conservative snapshot. That's what the report really stresses, that it excludes many people who were temporarily outdoors or those who were just unwilling to participate.
Absolutely. So the PIT count is only done for one night. So if an unhoused person finds shelter for that night, they would not be counted in this. And the typical number that we have estimates for from the city side can be up to 5,000. So the PIT count is very underrepresentative, but it's just a very broad look at how many people are unhoused in our city.
So the PIT count for 2025 in Albuquerque found that 2,960 people were experiencing homelessness. And as we mentioned earlier in the interview, that's an 8% increase from last year. Journal reporter Nikayla McClellan stopping by to share the latest with us. Thank you so much, Nikayla.
Thanks, Gino.
In other headlines from the newsroom, Albuquerque city officials are seeking an emergency court order to immediately clear a long-running homeless encampment outside Quirky used books and more, just days after 28-year-old Gregory Antone was fatally shot outside of the property. The city filed for a preliminary injunction Monday, arguing that continued camping poses, quote, irreparable harm due to what it calls a year-long pattern of crime, safety hazards, and code violations that are tied to the site. Officials say police have responded to the property 235 times in the past year, and that Antone was shot after an argument with people at the encampment. City Attorney Lauren Keefe said the shooting demonstrates why the encampment cannot be allowed to operate, citing ongoing drug activity, litter, and violence affecting nearby businesses and residents. The business owner, Gillum Curley, strongly disputes the city's claims and says the problems reflect broader homelessness and crime issues, not the campers themselves, and he vows to fight the injunction in court. The legal battle comes shortly after the city asked a judge to declare the bookstore a public nuisance, a move that could allow officials to evict campers and possibly force a sale of the property if the problems persist. City leaders say shutting down the encampment is necessary to avoid further violence and restore safety to the area. A new rehabilitation project in Albuquerque's International District is aiming to preserve affordable housing by upgrading rather than replacing aging buildings. Housing advocate Roger Valdez says many low-cost units become unaffordable when landlords must raise rents to cover long-delayed repairs. To prevent that cycle, state legislators, housing organizations, and the Center for Housing Economics are backing the full renovation of a 60-year-old 7-unit apartment complex at 609 Chama Southeast. Owned by the faith-based group New Creation Albuquerque, the building will receive new kitchens, bathrooms, windows, a roof, and other improvements. The $642,000 project is funded through a State Housing New Mexico grant and capital outlay dollars, and it includes a land use restriction agreement, ensuring the property remains affordable for 20 years. Energy-efficient upgrades, including solar power and electric water heaters, are expected to save tenants about $130 per month in utility costs. Residents, including 6-year tenant Julie Hayes, say they welcome the repairs and are relieved rents won't increase. Construction is set to begin this week and is expected to wrap up in early 2026, with temporary relocation available during the work. Valdez says the project shows how targeted investments can extend a building's life, preserve affordability, and deliver quick, meaningful benefits to New Mexicans. And Castellian Corporation, a California-based hypersonic missile manufacturer founded by former SpaceX executives, has officially selected Sandoval County as the site of its massive 1,000-acre production and testing campus. The decision ends months of anticipation and follows a competitive incentive package that includes $125 million in industrial revenue bonds, $6.7 million in state and local economic development funds, and land secured or leased by the county. Known as Project Ranger, the facility is expected to bring up to 300 high-paying jobs, more than $101 million in investments, and an estimated $650 million in economic impact over the next decade. Castellian leaders say New Mexico's technical expertise, proximity to the national labs and Spaceport America, and long scientific heritage made the state stand out among 40 nationwide contenders. The company plans to manufacture and test solid rocket motors and its full tail-to-tip hypersonic missile systems, all work that aligns with the federal government's expanded defense spending and Castellian's recent U.S. Army and Navy contracts. County officials say the long-term bomb package and land agreements will help Castellian scale up quickly while boosting the region's innovation economy. Construction could begin as early as 2026, marking what state leaders call a major advancement in New Mexico's role in national security and advanced manufacturing. The leading news is powered by the journalism of the Albuquerque Journal. If you enjoy hearing all of the stories we share with you here daily, please consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Journal by utilizing the discount code in our show notes. Every subscription helps support local journalism and allows us to provide you with the news that matters to you. Now taking a look at Albuquerque's weather forecast. Today you can expect partly sunny skies with a high near 63, and as for this evening, mostly cloudy with a low around 43. To keep up with all the latest news from the Albuquerque Journal, you can visit our website at abqjournal.com. That's the leading news. I'm Gino Gutierrez. We'll be back tomorrow.